Welcome our political commentators, Gareth Hughes and Liam Hehir. Kia ora koroa, welcome.
Kia ora morena.
Ina korua.
Now, Gareth is the director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa, a former Green MP, no longer a member of any political party. Liam Hehir is a Palmerston North lawyer, political commentator and member of the National Party. Let's just hit super quickly on those CPI figures as they feed into politics. National continues, particularly National, to talk economic growth. At the same time, it is quite determinedly trying to cut the size of the government as a proportion of the economy, and we've seen it remain pretty strict on things like public sector jobs, for example. Will it welcome, Liam, having seen a more modest CPI here, especially after the food numbers we got last week?
Yeah, well, it's still on the too high side, right? And the food numbers are still the thing that affects people's lived experience, and so the food numbers are not going to be offset by this. Now, that's not to say that the government's necessarily to blame. You can't have an export-led sort of recovery without also having pressure on prices for the things that you can also export. But inflation is always and everywhere the incumbent killer. It doesn't matter if you're to blame for it or not. If you don't get on top of it, if you don't get a good narrative around it, it's going to really harm your chances of getting re-elected. So good news maybe, or not so bad news, but it still doesn't offset the main thing, which is the food prices.
Liam, Gareth.
Oh, Liam's right. The government's in a sense made a rod for its own back. When under the previous government we saw such high international tradables inflation as we came out of COVID and supply shocks, the government was blaming Labor back then, and they've taken all the credit despite not really having the agency for the OCR cuts previously, which is done by the Independent Reserve Bank. So they've taken the credit for OCR cuts in the past, and they're going to have to wear this high sort of high-ish end of the inflation band. It's risen now for the last 3 quarters. We're higher than Australia. But I think the government's political problem around inflation is it just feeds into this general zeitgeist around cost of living, an economy that's sort of spluttering and stuttering, high unemployment, high underemployment. Kiwi go to Australia every 7 minutes, yet inflation is still stubbornly at the high end of the band. And the non-discretionary stuff that Kiwis can't really avoid, that's things like the food, which is up 5%, the rates, which is up 13%. And I know we're going to talk about local government soon, but what we see is a lot of other costs being lumped onto fees and levies and rates to pay for those tax cuts or to have the money shift. And this is why people are feeling so miserable, why the right track, wrong track is persistently negative at the moment. People are feeling grumpy because the economy's not doing particularly well. We're not seeing it turn that corner despite ag prices increasing. Inflation's still relatively high, and that non-discretionary stuff, the real cost of living, is higher than the overall inflation rate.
And Liam, that's the issue in some ways, isn't it? Government will be very pleased the primary sector is having 2 very strong years in a row, but of course the way that works is the world price is what determines the price of our butter and cheese and other dairy products. But the key issue for National, Liam, is whether or not this economy and the feelings about this economy turns the corner in time. I'm sure they'd be very happy to see another OCR cut or two. There's now a debate about how many more and when, yeah?
Yeah, it's unlikely. Although I think a key thing to remember is that the effect of previous cuts hasn't been fully felt yet. So, we have OCR cuts consistently since the government took office. As Gareth said, the government's agency for that is somewhat limited, but it's a rolling kind of effect, right? It's a delayed effect because people need to come off their fixed terms and go on to their new fixed terms or stay floating. So, I'm not saying that the government, isn't leaving it quite late in the day. But it certainly can be hopeful that as time moves on, things still should start to get better. But the problem is, of course, is that, the paradox is the one that you've pointed out. We're price takers for our primary economic sector, and things will in some ways get worse as a result of getting better. And that's just a paradox the government's going to have to live with, and it's going to have to wear the blame for it, whether it's caused it or not.
Okay, let's talk about what is happening with councils, and particularly the government's relationship with councils. was very aggressive in its messaging to councils last year at the local government conference, perhaps modified a little this year, but still a lot of, get your own house in order. And what we are seeing also, Gareth, is absolute moves to, it appears, constrain what governments can do. We talked earlier about what local governments can do. We talked earlier about the government the minister revealing that in RMA reforms, they will retain the ability to intervene if councils are doing things that are against employment or growth or jobs. And second, we've seen this move just at the local government conference last week to say, stop any plan changes you're working on until the reforms are in. What's your take on the messaging and the reasoning with respect to local government?
Well, there's an awful lot happening there with the narrative and the policies and, campaigns starting to pick up for towns and cities across the country. I should probably start with a disclosure. I just launched a policy guide with 100 policies for the public good and 80 case studies where we are seeing great stuff happening in local government to bring into this conversation. But at the beginning of this term, we saw a lot of language and during the last election around localism, the idea that central government was going to devolve some more power and maybe even some funding opportunities to local government. But in fact, what we've seen is the exact opposite of it. We see this message for councils just to return back to basics, removing the 4 wellbeings from the Local Government Act, Māori ward changes, potential rate capping, putting observers in, such as Wellington City Council, and now 2 Elku Government New Zealand super local conferences. We've had ministers come and basically tell local government off. Chris Bishop played that role this year, basically telling local government to stop work on their plans that they're already doing, taking aim at so-called luxuries like Green Star 6 buildings. But I do think it's a little ironic. I know Christopher Bishop was actually involved in the opening of a Green Star 6 pool in Tanainai Pools in the Hut. Actually, by being Green Star 6, it's actually saving 30% of its operating costs. So what we do see, however, is kind of a paternalistic government. It's central government saying, we know best, telling local government what to do and what not to do. They're saying, we've got a house in order, you need to get your house in order. But look, we see our central government running a persistent structural deficit because of the previous decisions around, unaffordable tax cuts for landlords. I don't think central government really should be the ones lecturing local government.
Okay, what's your take on the policy, Liam? I mean, passing blame is always a fairly useful political strategy, but is it more than that's behind some of what's going on?
Yeah, so disclosure on my part, I do a lot of work for local authorities, not in the sort of quote-unquote constitutional or administrative law space, but in terms of their commercial work. And so, like I said, I work with council officers a lot. I've got an insight into the constraints that are on them. I think on the base problem of all of this is that we want councils to plan like ministries, we want them to deliver like businesses, and we want them to spend like households or constrain their spending like households. And they've got a lot of constraints on them, and it's not helped by the fact that there's a lot of cost shifting from central government to local government without a lot of direction or assistance or really kind of help in terms of how they're going to pay for it. So I think, that's not to say though that everything local government does or the way that it interprets its mandate is beyond question. And so I think the sweet spot is to give local councils maximum autonomy, maximum localism within the defined things that we want local government to do. And so local government, it's not, it doesn't have the democratic mandate. It's not a devolved power. It's delegated from the central authority down to the local level to do those things that it is considered best able to do at that level. And yet we find that we've always got these grey areas about what we think council responsibilities are and what they're not. So I think the government hasn't got the sweet spot. It's taking the approach of lumping more uncertainty and more costs onto local government at the moment, but it's not actually taking the step of constraining what it can do is a good thing if it actually gives local government a very good idea about the things it shouldn't be spending money on.
Okay, well, let me give you a couple of examples, though. The climate adaptation stuff is really interesting because the councils are shrieking, and so is the Insurance Council, that they still cannot stop new developments happening in areas that are flood-prone. So they're saying, before anything else comes down the route of climate adaptation legislation, can we please act on that? That's one thing. I know the Mayor of Tasman. Sorry, Liam, I'll come back in a second. I know the Mayor of Tasman was very concerned about the level of central government assistance that might come in the wake of the recent flood events in Nelson, Tasman, and yet, whose issue primarily is that? It's a climate change issue, and is it all going to be councils expected to pick up the pieces when at the same time they seem to be lacking the powers to take control of what gets built where?
Perfect example. I mean, it's not just the climate resilience stuff. That's a really good example, but we've also got the national policy statement on urban development, right? So that's going to cause a whole lot of new infrastructure costs that councils are going to have to figure out how to wear. What role is legitimate for council to take in local economic development, and what's outside what it should be doing? This cost shifting happens all the time, and so I do have a lot of sympathy for local government. I think the government needs to be a lot clearer, and they're making noises about that, but unless they make it crystal clear as to what local government should and shouldn't be doing, and how they should and shouldn't be paying for this or that, and giving them all the levers they actually reasonably need to do to meet the mandates that are put on them, I think that local government does have the right to complain a bit.
Gareth, also on my mind is the proposed rates cap. Now, how does that work? Do you just decide there's a blanket rates cap across everybody, including those who are quite up to date with their three waters and others who are just about to start? I know we're supposed to be moving to this off-books kind of model when it comes to that issue specifically, but some councils are more proactive across a suite of issues and costs that they face. How would it work?
And I think that's the $100 million question. How actually would it work? Because what do you do with your high growth regions that need to be borrowing more or increasing rates to put in the infrastructure for that growth? What's going to happen with natural disasters? And pertaining to your last question, are we actually going to see even more deferred maintenance if we cap this? So I think this is one of these policies which sound good as a headline, but the actual implementation is going to be devilishly hard. And the government's trying to tap into that public grumpiness with rates rises. We saw that 13% making up the inflation we've seen in the last 12 months. It is a real burden that lots of people are in. But the problem is you can't just cap rates without giving local government more genuine opportunities to raise revenues. I note that both the ACT and New Zealand First parties have been sceptical. There's no guarantee that the government even has the support of its coalition partners to cap rates. But the problem is, of course, is that we've just got a broken funding model for local government. Already, local government debt is some of the highest in the developed world. UK, Europe, it's under 100% of revenue. In New Zealand, where the limit is 280, and some councils up to 350%. When you look at the graph of the countries, we've got some of the highest local government debt of any country in the world, and no rates capping is going to fix that, because you just got all this deferred maintenance in the pipeline. The government just needs to get on with these more substantial policy solutions. I know both ACT and New Zealand First have policies around some form of GST sharing with the regions. I think that's a pretty good practical step that the government should be expediting.
Let's have a look at education. She's a very busy minister, Erica Stanford. We saw announcements last week about the school property. She'd said she was going to set up the new school property agency. That looks like it's underway. It'll start off, I think, sitting within MBIE initially, does it? Starts off within an agency and then will go out on its own. She's scrapped the open plan classrooms approach and a back to the future. But now this is a different kettle of fish, really, isn't it? Eyeing up perhaps some fairly fundamental reform to NCEA, Liam.
Yeah, and long overdue, I have to say. Although I hope that whatever reform that there is can have enough bipartisan or multi-partisan support to be stable. But as it is, it's just not, it's too many standards. It's just not a measure. I mean, as an employer, I wouldn't even look at it. You can't tell what it's telling you about a potential job applicant or what someone's capabilities are and what they've learned or haven't learned. Funnily enough, I was looking around for some personal papers and I actually dug up my old school C and sixth form certificate and bursary marks the other day, and it was just one page. It was A's and B's and occasional C's. And, I'm not saying that we need to go back to anything like that, but we need to go back to something that actually communicates what actually has been learned and what can be done. The problem with NCEA, of course, is that ever since it's been in place, and I was the last generation to have the old system, I was in the last cohort, is that there's constantly being tinkered with one year to the next. And so, I think this is the last chance, right? Get it right, bring in some meaningful reforms that let employers and parents know what progress is, but do it in such a way as that you don't need to continually tinker with it again in the future.
Yeah, I mean,
there's no doubt that there's a problem because schools are turning away from it, right?
Well, there's a lot of schools beginning to pick up on the Cambridge or the baccalaureate or whatever. Interestingly, though, those marks on your paper, I don't know how much they do tell them. They tell you they passed or failed, but also
it's a drafting gate.
Half of people failed, Liam. That was the issue.
Yeah.
And so this was about people who didn't get over the 50%. Because that's the rules, being able to show what skills they did have. Gareth,
it's a drafting gate,
yeah.
Catherine, and so the new drafting gate is a bachelor degree. So we've pushed out what the drafting gate is out from high school to the end of university.
Gareth, would you agree that there's been some sort of unintended consequences and some things go wrong a bit with how NCEA has been applying? Hardly anybody, it seems, sits exams. You'll hear anecdotes all the time about how I've got my credits, I'm not going to sit the exam externally. What are your views on how it's all going?
Well, firstly, Liam's making me feel very old because I still did school cert and bursary. And as a parent with a year 13 student going through NCEA level 3 at the moment, as a parent, I find it, bafflingly hard to navigate exactly how many credits he's got and credits in the right subjects and how many he's got still to come, etc. So just as a parent, it's very difficult to navigate the system. And I'm kind of pleased actually to hear Minister Erica Stanford saying all options are on the table. It does look like we probably need some pretty major reform in this sector. This new government briefing that's came out in June sort of really undermines the credibility of the system, because what we see is a system with so much flexibility that a lot of students are picking the really easy subjects. Only 22% of kids last year got NCEA through exams. So with my kids, they just don't turn up to exams. And as a parent, it's baffling. Why on earth would you not go to an exam? But there's a sense of not gaming the system, but playing the system as it is. So
the other thing, Gareth, is I think that's coming through.
We need that bipartisan consensus going
I think
forward.
the other thing that's coming through, I note you on the bipartisanship, agreed. If only we could get that on anything, let alone everything. I think the other thing that's coming through is not just the not sitting the exams, but it's also even putting together a coherent program that adds up to, yes, you have this body of skills that makes sense. One bit talks to another bit, has been an issue as well. She is a busy minister, Liam, and is she one of the how would you rate her in terms of the performance in cabinet? However you want to measure that.
I think she's doing well. Okay, I think that she's her heart's in the right place. I think that she's not afraid to stand up to more reactionary elements within the government's own support base. I think that it's funny. It's like being the agriculture minister in a Labour government. I think being the education minister in a national government is just a bed of nails. You're always going to really be behind the eight ball, but we haven't had too many problems on that front, probably because she's more from that liberal side of things, and she possibly has a little bit more credibility because she's not a fire-breathing right-winger.
You want to comment, Gareth, as we wrap?
Oh, no, I think she's doing pretty well compared to the rest of the cabinet.
Short and sweet. Pithy, I think we call that, Gareth. Thank you, Gareth Hughes and Liam Hehir.